Good afternoon. I'm Officer Willenthal. It's my privilege to open the ceremonies for, I believe, the 35th Kusch lecture, if I counted correctly on the program. You can check. And it's my role to talk a little bit about Polykarp Kusch, for whom this lecture series is named. A few overlaps between Polykarp Kusch and myself. He was a physicist. He was a provost. He won the Nobel Prize. I didn't win the Nobel Prize. But Polykarp Kusch, after a great career at Columbia University, including the work that earned him the Nobel Prize for measuring to the highest precision by far up to that time what is called the anomalous magnetic moment of the electron, which led very swiftly to the creation by Schwinger, Feynman, and Tomononga of quantum electrodynamics, which remains the, as people will say, the highest achievement of theoretical physics or all of science. Now, agreement between theory and experiment to 10 decimal places. But Polykarp Kusch was the first in the post-war years to use the modern technology developed for radar and other applications to measure the magnetic moment of the electron to very high precision. He was provost at Columbia University during tumultuous times that we hope the Academy never experiences again. And I presume those negative experiences, plus family in Dallas, helped UT Dallas recruiting as a distinguished professor, regental professor, the first Eugene McDermott professor, the University of Texas at Dallas, just a couple of years after we became the University of Texas at Dallas. And while only a few of us today overlapped with the Polykarp Kusch, those who did testify that what you can read on our website, very nice article, which I reread this morning. He was a deeply engaged faculty member. He was not a remote icon sitting on the shelf. He taught introductory physics. He taught it very well. He taught physics for poets. He was engaged in all kinds of faculty life during his time at UT Dallas. So he really was a deeply engaged citizen that really established the standard of excellence for UT Dallas. I thought I might give you a brief lesson in quantum electrodynamics, or just electrodynamics, or just electricity and magnetism. But when I went to Google and Wikipedia, I realized that if I ever understood it, I don't anymore. Suffice it to say that Kusch's measurements detected a 2,000th difference between the classical prediction of quantum mechanics and reality, which led to the breakthroughs of Feynman and Schwinger. So now you've had your history of physics lessons, Kyle. And now even the greater honor devolves to our Dean of Economic, Political, and Policy Sciences, Jennifer Holmes, who will introduce our honoree. Jennifer.
Thank you, Officer. It's a real pleasure and honor to introduce my colleague, Dr. Alex Piquero. He's an Ashbel Smith Professor of Criminology, and he also serves as Associate Dean. So I think following up on our namesake, this is someone who's really spent a lot of time investing in the institution. He has published over 400 peer-reviewed articles, and I hope that pace doesn't slow down, as since he's right around the corner from me, and he's a great touchstone for me when I need a sounding board and to read an email or any sort of input. He's a fantastic colleague and very valued to the school, so I hope that doesn't interfere with your research productivity. But he has been recognized as the world's most cited criminologist, and he's held this distinction since 1996. So it's quite a run. He's well known for his evidence-based policy impact. He's done countless congressional hearings and testimony. He's had service as an appointed board member of a U.S. Attorney General, the Office of Justice Program Science Advisory Board, and many, many such high-level, high-impact positions. He's also helped us locally, right? I mean, he really is, like my namesake, deeply involved in faculty governance and other service, and he helped UT System and UT Dallas navigate the campus carry debate and policy implementation, which was touchy, but he did very well. Matching that is his commitment to students. He's a role model. He's always mentoring students. He's been recognized with numerous high-level teaching awards when he was at Maryland, the TERP Teaching Award in 2008. Here in 2014, he received the Rhoda, the Regents Outstanding Teaching Award, and recently has been appointed to UT System's Academy of Distinguished Teachers. So I could go on and on about Alex and his many achievements, but I think I'd rather invite him to the stage and have him give us our presentation, Nothing Fake Here, Debunking the Immigration Crime Relationship. So thank you all for being here.
I don't recognize that guy they just talked about. really kind of interesting. So, of all the great things in one's academic career, this has got to be the really coolest one. It'll also be cool because you've probably never seen a presentation like the one you're going to see today, in terms of the way I do lecturing and teaching. So, Dr. Muhlenthal talked really interestingly about the connections that he had with Dr. Polykarp Kusch, and I thought I would give you what my connections are, somewhat, to this lecture's namesake. He was a consultant at IBM. My parents worked there, so that's kind of close. He was a fellow at Stanford University's Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences. I was too. For those of you who've been to the center, it sits on top of a beautiful hill overlooking Palo Alto's campus. There's a nice volleyball court there and everything. So we have that in common. And in the bio that Dr. Muhlenthal talked about this morning, Polykarp Kusch referenced himself as being an adequate scientist but a superb teacher. And that's how I've envisioned my career in terms of the 25 years or so I've been doing this. So this is what I have in common with this person's lecture namesake. So I think it's important for those of you who have been to this thing in the past. You may remember a wonderful lecture last year in the Alumni Center by Dr. Osboth called Our Journey Home, My Life and Work in Dallas. One of the most memorable parts of her lecture last year was her being in a restaurant where the Beatles played. For those of y'all who were there that day, I couldn't believe that story, and I thought that was a really cool story. So I thought I'd remember this. There's a point to this. Trust me. The year before that, Dr. Muhlenthal gave us a fabulous talk on his career, starting in New Mexico and going forward from there. On the life cycle of a science, I study life cycles of crime, so that's close. And he had this really cool picture that I really liked. And so that's what I have in common with that lecture from 2 years ago. But what all three of us have in common is a deep appreciation for music. Because I play music, and all of them play music and enjoy music. So that's the link there. A lot of you don't know a little about me, so I thought it's really important for those of you in the room who have no idea who I am to get to know who I am as a person and my background and why in so many ways I shouldn't even be standing on this stage. I do play in a band, had played in a band for one of our main professional societies. Back in 1991, we started to raise money for minority scholarships to go to graduate school. At that time, our American Society of Criminology had 0 of those. And today, we now have over 10 of those. And so every Friday night at our conference, a bunch of us would play the Beatles, Stones, and about every possible Motown song you can dance to, because they're all 3 chords in the truth. And you get to see all the people you read in grad school, like, dance all night long after they've been out having fun. So that's a big part of my life is playing music. The most rewarding part of my life, and a lot of them are here, are graduate students. There's nothing like mentoring the next generation who then go out to do really great things. So that's a big part of me. Many of you in the room know the other better Dr. Piquero. This is after her, she's a runner. I try to run, so that's close. This is in her home Pittsburgh when we ran a marathon there. Or she ran a marathon, I ran a half, sorry. And that's just me with a suit on. All right, so where do I come from? That's the Cuban flag, not the Puerto Rican flag for the Puerto Ricans in the room. Different color combinations of that one. My mom and dad were from Cuba. They were political refugees who left Havana, Cuba in 1961 when they were teenagers. And at that time, they were allowed to leave the country with the possessions they had, and they walked onto a plane or walked onto a boat. That's how my mom and dad left Cuba in 1961 at the age of 17. Came to the United States for the promise of freedom and a better life, like a lot of other people in this room probably have. My dad at the time, that's my dad on the, well, your left, my right. My dad was a pro baseball player. He actually was given a contract by the Washington Senators at that time, who are today's Minnesota Twins. Dean Holmes, the Minnesota Twins. And he had to give that up to leave the country and find a better way out of there. That's my mom. She was gorgeous back then. Still is. They dated in high school. It's really wild. So they dated since they were 15 years old. It's like a Hallmark movie. So Meg Ryan's going to come down the room, and Tom Hanks will meet her in the middle, and be a nice rom-com. But that's where I come from. So I have a deep appreciation for this topic that I'd like to share a little bit about with you today. I can't do the work I've done without people giving me a bunch of money to do the work, because this kind of work is really, really expensive. Starts with the MacArthur Foundation, who I am indebted deeply to, and you'll hear a little bit about them. Center for Disease Control, the Justice Department, Pennsylvania and Arizona's crime commissions. So this is a sticker sold at a mobile gas station. Mobiles aren't very common in this part of the country, but in Germantown, Wisconsin, where you can get, when you're checking out at the counter, and the little postcard things around, USA illegal immigrant hunting permit, no bag limit, tagging not required. So these kind of stickers show up in a lot of places. So it's this Germantown, Wisconsin one is not an atypical one. The whole immigration and crime debate is very contentious. Can't escape it right now in our world. There's a perception that immigrants commit more crime, and that perception is at the macro level when you're looking at crime rates, and at the micro level when you're looking at what people do in terms of their offending patterns. That's the perception. And all of you may remember W.I. Thomas's very famous quote from the early part of the 20th century: if you perceive a situation as real, it is real in its consequences. These consequences are really significant for human beings. Much of the work in this area has been done at the macro level, because that's where most of the data has existed, with very little work done at the micro level. There are only a few studies that contain such data, but most of those studies have been focused on community samples. So we don't know a lot about the immigration-crime relationship among the people who are actually offending in the real world. Okay? Problem is the lack of data. And in our world, we need data to answer questions. A parallel to this in my research on immigration and crime is my research on life course criminology, which is why people start offending, why they continue to offend, and then why they stop. So we're talking about continuity and change in offending. So if I would ask you in the room, what age were you when you first did something? You'd give me that age. And then I'd say, what age were you when you stopped doing that thing? You'd give, if you're still doing it, you'd give me a particular age as well. So we're trying to understand the pattern of offending over time, why people start, why they continue, and why they stop. We also are focused on the context in which people reside and work and live. So I use this example all the time. If I drive around Highland Park, and then I drive 6 miles south to Fair Park, those two parks don't look anything alike. One's Highland and one's Fair, and nothing around them looks a lot alike. So you have to understand the experiences of the people day to day in those environments to understand what they have to deal with on a day-to-day circumstance in their families and in their schools. Parallel to this whole idea is this idea called segmented assimilation theory, which is very common in sociology and the study of immigration. And there's a lot of, I violate the number of words per slide here, so I'm just going to talk you through this. This is trimmed, sorry. I'm really bad at it. First-generation immigrants are people who come to this country on their own. So my mom and dad would be considered first-generation immigrants. I would be considered a second-generation immigrant. I have one or more parents who are from another country, and I was born in the United States. There's a lot of research that talks about the difficulties that second-generation immigrants have. So first-generation immigrants come to this country from whatever country they come from, and they hold true to their own values and culture and morals and food. It's really what a lot of immigrants hold on to. For the Hispanics in the room, you know what I'm talking about. But the second generation is stuck. We still have to have the first generation influence, but our parents are telling us, we want you to be American. So you're like, okay, so my friends do this, and then you want me to do this, and we are like, so what do we do? Negotiating that is not very easy for second generation immigrants because you're living in two different worlds with two different languages and two different very sets of customs. So for example, in the Cuban culture growing up, you don't talk back at authority. So if the teacher says this, you say, okay, you're the teacher. You don't say, I disagree with you, teacher. All right? Or when a person from authority is talking to you, you can look down. You're respecting the authority. It's a different culture that people come to the table with. So the first generation hold on to their motherlands. Second generation's trying to figure these things out. So there's this little conflict that second generation immigrants have, and sometimes they get stuck in offending patterns. Let me flip right through this. Program of research that I've been involved in, that I'm going to talk to you today about, is focused on trying to unpack the immigration and crime link with data that we've had to obtain because you can't get it anywhere else. Over the past 20 years, I've been involved in 4 studies that have looked at this exact issue, all different kinds of studies, different kinds of samples, different parts of the country, to try to understand what this immigration crime linkage looks like. We've looked at adolescent samples, we've looked at community-based samples, we've looked at offender-based samples to try to triangulate those sets of studies to see if we get the same kinds of findings over time. Fortunately, our work has been appearing in lots of really good journals across disciplines. So why do I start with Temple? I would not be anywhere without Temple because that was my first academic job. So there's a reason why I'm showing you the Temple slide. I was in the Criminal Justice Department, which is in Gladfelter Hall. For those of you who have been to Temple, it's very different these days. It's in North Philadelphia. It's an interesting place. I picked up a phone, not that phone, but a phone, because at Temple, I had just started my career. I learned of a psychology professor there. His name was Larry Steinberg, one of the world's prominent developmental psychologists. So being Cuban, Cubans don't really have much to worry about, and we don't make excuses. We just do things. I picked up the phone and I called him. I said, hey, I just learned that you were granted a MacArthur Foundation research network. For those of you who are not familiar with these things, it is the gold mine of an academic life. MacArthur brings in a bunch of really smart people, academics and practitioners, puts them around a room, and then says, you tell us what we need to do in this program of research. Blah. Ours was on adolescent development and juvenile justice. That's what our task was. We can decide to do anything we wanted. We could do any kind of study. We could launch any kind of research program at no cost constraint. So I was a brand new assistant professor. I just picked up the phone and say, hi, Dr. Steinberg, would you like to meet with me? I'm a brand new blah, blah, blah. I thought he was going to hang up the phone. So he says, no, come by my office. His office was in Weiss Hall. And Philadelphia, before food trucks were cool everywhere in the world, food trucks were very cool in Philadelphia. So we met outside of the food truck, and he says, why don't you come to one of our network meetings at the Four Seasons Hotel? Sure, I can do that. So I went to this network meeting, and around the room were all these great psychologists and lawyers and practitioners and judges, and I basically had to talk about a research program that I thought they would be interested in doing. So for 20 minutes, I gave this, okay, you can leave the room, and then wait outside. I thought, okay, I'm either passing or failing. So he came in and said, why don't you come to dinner with us tonight? I thought, okay, great. So it all worked out. So what MacArthur Foundation gave to us was a blank check to do a program of research to study why kids offend and how they negotiate the juvenile justice system. But like any good, true form of academics, we came up with a battery of questions that were like this big because we wanted to ask every possible thing in the world from the kids we were going to study. But fortunately, over the course of our time, our research actually ends up being cited in Supreme Court cases in the late 2000s. So it's kind of neat to actually see our research that we developed in a US Airways club at the Philadelphia airport when we designed our own study, actually shows up in the real world some years later. So that's the history. This is the Pathways to Desistance study. This is the study I just referred to that we were able to launch. This study is the first of its kind in the United States. It is a study of 1,300 serious adolescent offenders. So these are kids who are felonious offenders. They're not stealing from 7-Eleven. Okay? So to get into our study, you have had to commit a serious felony offense, ag assault, robbery, those kinds of offenses. The kids were between 14 and 18 years old, and we recruited them from both Philadelphia and Phoenix. And you're probably wondering, well, Alex, of all the cities in the country, why Philadelphia and Phoenix? Well, because that's where they said we could do the study. And that's where their data systems allowed us to get the data we needed. So there's always a practicality of doing research in the real world. So but they were very fortunate sites because Philadelphia and Phoenix have lots of diversity. And we were able to capture, just by the fact that these kids were in our study in those locations, a hefty amount of immigrant kids in our study, first generation and second generation. So we were able, at that time, we didn't realize this at the time, we were able to track for over a 7-year period all of their criminal offending at the local level, and we also get self-report studies. We interviewed them every 6 months. We got all the FBI national record checks and 3-hour battery of information on any possible construct that you could think would be relevant at that time to study adolescent decision making. It's one-of-a-kind study, quite expensive. We also asked questions on ethnic identity, since we knew we had a lot of Hispanics in the study. Questions about, I'm happy that I'm a member of a group I belong to. I speak English mainly at home. Those kinds of questions that are very common in that part of the literature. So this is the study. You can see where they are at. Phoenix had the largest group of first-generation kids. Most of them were Mexican, not a surprise. Philadelphia had the second largest group of first-generation kids, mostly Puerto Rican. A lot of Puerto Ricans settle in northwest part of Philadelphia. And the rest of the kids were those demographic percentages there. So about 1,000 kids who were native-born, 200 and so second-gen, and 83 very small first-gen. So I'm going to review real quickly a few studies and just the main findings of these studies, because then we're going to get into the part of the presentation that you're not going to forget when you leave the room. That's a little carrot I'm going to dangle for a second. Our first study that got a significant amount of media attention, and you'll see why in a little while, was a study that we looked at just the data set I just described, and we just plotted out the offending patterns. We plotted them out with self-report data, and then we plotted it out with official record searches. We did national FBI record searches for these kids, which is really, really hard to pull off, but we were able to do that. And the question was here, is immigrant generation predictive of different prevalence of offending or frequency of offending? So in other words, this first generation, second generation, and native-born kids, do their offending patterns look different over the 7 years of the study? So all we did was plot it out. And yes, we've done all the significance testing, and we can do all that stuff. I can show you all that stuff later. But I like pictures a lot, and I'm going to go right to the picture. So here's the cool part of this slide. I didn't learn how to do animation until that. Very neat. The first generation immigrants had the lowest official arrests over the course of the entire study. The differences become significant as you move farther on and these kids turn into their early 20s. But this was the first time ever in the academic literature that anybody had ever been able to produce an offending pattern comparison across immigrant groups and native-born Americans. That's what we found for official records. So you're like, okay, well, that's all nice and dandy. What do the self-report records show? Well, the self-report records show the same finding. So whether you study it with official records, whether you study it with self-report records, the substantive story is the same. First-generation kids offend at lower rates than native-born Americans do. This finding didn't make some people very happy. We're going to get to that in a moment. So you're sitting there going, well, that's all nice and dandy, Alex. Why do they offend less? One of the reasons we thought about at the time was work that was being done at the intersection of psychology and law by a guy named Tom Tyler, who now was between Yale and NYU. And we published a paper using his idea of some concept called legal socialization. All of us have this, we just never termed it this way. Legal socialization is basically the internalization of laws and rules that we have. So all of us say, okay, no, it's wrong to do certain kinds of things because we were taught not to do those kinds of things, and we grow up being good people who don't do those kinds of things. That's the whole idea of legal socialization. There is evidence to show that there's something called legitimacy. Legitimacy is the quality possessed by an authority, a law, or an institution that leads others to feel obligated to obey the law. So most of us in the room feel obligated to obey certain laws, maybe not some other laws, but most laws we obey. Okay? There's also something called legal cynicism, which is kind of the opposite. So when people have bad experiences with agents of formal social control, they become cynical. And that cynicism helps them get some fuel in them to make them offend, so the theory goes. Then there's the whole idea called social costs of punishment. A lot of us don't want to offend because we fear what those repercussions are. We could lose our job, we could lose our spouse, we could lose our family, we could lose lots of different kinds of things in life. All of these things are part and parcel of this idea of legal socialization. It's all of these things that kind of stand in a bit of an orbit around us. I didn't mean orbit as a joke, but the orbit people know. So it's an orbit that stands kind of around us. So we looked at first generation, second generation, native-born kids. Just simple graphs to see what do the trends look like. Our argument is that the immigrants have more legal socialization because they're coming to this country for the promise of a better life. They're escaping kind of not very good places to come to what they think is a much better place. So that's the idea we tested here. And again, I'm just going to show you the plots. This is for the social costs of punishment. This is the first generation, the blue graph. They don't look significant, but they are. The first generation kids are more likely to have higher costs of punishment. In other words, they are fearful that they will be punished if they do certain kinds of things. Also did the same thing for legitimacy. The first generation kids are more likely to believe in the legitimacy of the law than our native-born and second generation kids. Finally, for legal cynicism, this one I think is very interesting. The first generation and the native-borns don't matter. But remember what I told you about the second generation kind of being stuck? The second generation is the most legally cynical. They're in this little like weird spot. So that was a really interesting little finding too. So our next question was, well, are the people lying? Are immigrants lying about their offending? Now remember what I told you is we had data on self-report records and we had data on official records. So what we do now is we compare the self-report and the official records. So we look to see where the convergence is in those patterns and where the divergence is in those patterns. And if immigrants are lying, which some people say they do to hide their offending, then we should see a lot of aberrations in the graphs. You might see where this is going now. The top bar is around 90%. First generation, second generation, native-born Americans. There is almost complete convergence when you look at their self-report offending and their official offending. Almost identical. Underreporting, in terms of who's saying, no, I didn't get arrested, but they actually were, no difference across the groups as well. So there's no difference whether it's first gen, second gen, or native born about lying or not lying in terms of their offending behavior. Again, didn't have to turn out that way, but then we have never seen this finding before because no one had that level of data to do it. All right, study 4, moving along. This is a map from the Pew Research Center. For those of y'all who've used the Pew Research data, they're wonderful. These are estimated because we really don't know the answer. There's a lot of questions about, well, how many unauthorized immigrants are in the United States? 6 million, 11 million, 90 million. No one knows the answer to that question. So you just have to estimate. Okay? These are the cities in the United States. Larger the circle, more. Of people who are unauthorized immigrants. LA's got a good substantial number of them. New York City, of course, Dallas and Houston are pretty sizable there. So we started another study about in southern LA, in LA County, that actually collected data on unauthorized immigrants. In other words, people who are here illegally. Kids. Okay? So these are kids in the justice system. And we wanted to see if the kids in the justice system, who are involved in a 3-year study that we're following them in, are they offending more than legal immigrants and native-born Americans? Because the narrative is they're the worst of the worst of the worst of the worst. All right. So if we put aside the fact that they are here illegally, which itself is a crime, put that aside, when they are here, are they offending more? That's the question posed to us. Again, no other data set in the world exists on this topic. This is the first one. So it's always good when you're the first because the bar is lower. when you're out later, the bar is higher. So again, just some little graphs to show you. Guess what's coming? Guess what's coming? Illegal first-generation kids have lower self-report offending over the course of the 3-year study so far. These kids are still in adolescence. So we're still tracking them into adulthood. But right now, they're starting at same curve that you saw at the beginning, first set of graphs in the other different study, same kind of finding that you're seeing over time. We also did it here as well, looking at what's called a variety of offending. So there's different ways of measuring criminal offending patterns. A variety of offending is we give people a series of 20 questions. Did you do this? Did you do this? Did you do this? Did you do this? And you create what's called a variety score. So you're counting all the number of different things you do. It's kind of like going to the buffet. There's 40 options, and you pick 1, 2, 3, whatever it is. Right? So once again, the illegal first-generation kids are committing the lowest offending in the data set. So whether the story is illegal immigrants, whether the story is first-generation immigrants, whether you're looking at older kids, younger kids, community sample kids, kids in the system, the same substantive finding continues to show up. All right. Study number 5. We're getting close to the good part. All right, so one of the great things about this program of research is all these studies that I've worked with graduate students and young assistant professors that I've worked closely with around the country. This one is an interesting study that we just released. It's a qualitative study about kids at the Texas-Mexican border who go to several universities there. And we asked them about their interactions with Office of Field Operations Customs Border Patrol agents. In other words, when you go back and forth, and these are legal American citizens. They're regular, like you and I are. What are your experiences like with these individuals? Interesting set of findings. We asked them, when crossing the US border, have you been treated differently than those around you? Okay? Have you ever witnessed someone around you being treated differently than anybody else? Have you or someone around you ever been harassed or mistreated by an individual in authority? And do you think this is due to your race, ethnicity, or country of origin? So we asked these open-ended questions, okay? And we let the respondents tell us, these are our experience with the Customs and Border Patrol agents at the border. What we found was some really interesting findings. There was a lot of work on people with darker skin felt being treated differently. So, for example, I'm an American citizen, but from Cuban heritage. I have fairly, I guess, olive's the color, olive darker skin. So I've been considered Greek, I've been considered Spanish, but never Cuban, sometimes white. All right? So just because of the color of the skin, people feel like they're treated differently. So here are some of the exact quotes from the respondents. Being a light-skinned Mexican-American man, I get mistaken for looking white. Other family members are considerably darker than I, and often sometimes are not treated as well as myself. The darker shade of brown your skin color is, the ruder the OFO officer behaves. Sometimes for simply having Hispanic features, you may be treated differently. My parents are always treated different just because of their lack of English vocabulary. They don't sound American enough. They have an accent. Cars with license plates from Mexico are always questioned more and always get their vehicles sent to be checked further. A few other quotes about rude behavior and harassment. After finding 3 brand new Apple iPhones lying on my car's back seat, the OFO officer mistakenly thought I was trying to bring the phones into the United States and therefore did not need to be declared to customs upon re-entry. OFO officers looked at every white person's driver's license for a few seconds and gave it back to them, but to the Mexicans, they had to take out their passports and their luggage and be searched head to toe. My friends were kept at a checkpoint for more than 8 hours by the authority or officers, even though my friends had all the required documents to enter the United States. They had their passports and their I-20s, but they were still kept there waiting, and the officers checked them physically and also had their phones checked. They were asked if they had any Muslim friends. The story of my mom not yet being a citizen and all 3 of us siblings being American struck a curiosity in the officers that something was off. So they would ask us and my mom to sing the national anthem or answer history questions which none of us knew because we were small and not that far along in history or being able to memorize very important events in the U.S. history. Lastly, one of my friends needs to buy contraceptive pills in Mexican border city for a treatment. So when she came back to the United States, one of the officers told her, it's too bad that you don't want to make babies here in the United States. All quotes. Last study. This is a study with another one of my former PhD students when I was at the University of Florida. He's in charge of the Department of Juvenile Justice data in the state of Florida. So he has every single possible question you can ask and answer of every kid in the juvenile justice system. So and these kids are released and followed in the community for a period of time. So we were interested in trying to look at whether or not immigrant concentration in particular areas is associated with more or less crime. There's lots of different philosophies on this. This whole idea of immigrant concentration comes from a lot of research in sociology that talks about immigrants, when they move to a particular community, they kind of live right near each other, and they become insular. They speak the same language, they have the same culture, they eat the same foods, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So we wanted to see if, in fact, this held true. This is a little graph. What you have there on the far left, your left-hand side, is the immigrant concentration in the zip code, because that's the level of detail we were able to get. For those of you who work with macro-level data, even getting harder and lower, like it's more and more difficult. So immigrant concentration, the more immigrant concentration you have, the lower the likelihood of recidivism 2 years after release from the Department of Juvenile Justice. Also, in areas that have a higher immigrant concentration, you also have a higher likelihood of having more two-parent families. And you also have a lower likelihood of having a family member who's incarcerated. So whether or not you look at the individual level studies we've talked about, and now you look at the macro level studies that we've talked about, there's something protective about immigrant status in the United States in different cities, at different time periods, at different levels of analysis that continue to show the same substantive finding. All right. You know you've hit a nerve when Ann Coulter decides to write an op-ed about you. I remember my news person, she's my news person, she's the best. Kim Horner sends me an email, a text, and says, did you see this? I'm like, I have no idea what it is. She goes, you got to see this. Do you want to respond? I'm like, I'm not responding. No way. This is like a badge of honor. So Ann Coulter writes this great, it's great in a way, op-ed, and you got to bear with me, because I'm going to read it to you, because it's real. And the moral of the story is that it shows you that when you do certain kind of research, and as you do it as best as you possibly can do it, with the best data you have available, there still will be headwinds going at you when you're flying the plane. All right? So this is what she starts off with saying. The second main line of attack on the idea that immigrants are committing prodigious amounts of crime are the apocryphal studies. The two researchers whose work is cited over and over and over again for the proposition that immigrants are less criminal than Americans are myself and my friend and colleague Bianca Bersani at UMass Boston. Pew cites their studies, and everyone in the media cites Pew, leading to headlines like these. UT Dallas prof finds immigrant kids less likely to commit serious crimes and reoffend. UMass Boston prof, stereotype of criminal immigrant doesn't hold up. Surprise, Donald Trump is wrong about immigrants and crime. Curiously, we are never shown the actual studies, but we are simply told, with some heat, studies show. Okay? I looked up some of these alleged studies last weekend. They're all hidden behind ridiculous paywalls. I was often only the sixth person to read them. Now, we have a great library. You know, you have to buy this. But wait, there's more. It turns out that neither Bersani nor Piquero compared immigrant crime to the overall population, as the British Guardian recently claimed in an article purporting to prove Donald Trump wrong. Rather, they compare immigrants' crime rate to the crime rate of America's most criminally inclined subgroups. Thus, for example, when you get past the paywall, you'll find that Piquero and Bersani's joint study used as its base group adolescents who were found guilty of a serious offense. That's not a representative sample of Americans. We never said it was. It's a representative sample of teenagers who are convicted criminals, which is what we said. Instead of looking at studies, how about we just count the number of immigrants arrested, convicted, and imprisoned in America? There's this thing in math called a numerator and a denominator. And you need those both numbers to come up with a real answer. But let's just get past the numerator and denominator. Even if immigrants' crime rates were the same as the overall population, and according to her, it's not, we're supposed to be admitting immigrants who are better than us, not 6 of one, half dozen of the other. But wait, there's more. Why? Because we're picking them. If the food in your refrigerator is rotten, you don't go out and buy more rotten food on the grounds that it's no more rotten than the food you already have. This is the new food you're picking and paying for. That's what she said. Fact. Instead, we're bringing in legal immigrants, forget illegals, who are way more criminal than us, notwithstanding phony studies that no one bothers to read. Right? That was a great one. All right. So, who cares what she says? All right. This is the issue I think the onus is on, whether it's social science or material science or whatever, insert whatever science it is. We have a duty, I think, especially in public institutions, to take our work and take our work outside of our journals and our books, which is, that's the currency we all operate in. We all get that. But we have more to do than just that. And the more to do with just that is to get those findings and that discussion out into the public to have a conversation about. Whether or not we affect policy, who knows, unlikely, especially right now. But the point is you're trying to get the best available science out there. We've done a real strong push on this front. Our UT Dallas news office has been very, very helpful in this regard. We've done newspapers, we've done TV, we've done podcasts with anybody who will do a podcast with us. Brian Williams, who's the famous doctor here in Dallas, who was there on the day of the ambush at the police department. He was the one in Parkland who actually operated on the officers. He actually has his own podcast called Race, Violence, and Medicine. It's fantastic. So the idea is to get our work out there. But when you get your work out there, you get your work out there to different constituents in different ways and in a way that they understand for their purposes. So if I'm trying to translate my work to the Rotary, which I've done before here in Richardson, I talk about it in a certain way. When I go do legislative briefings, I do that in a certain kind of way. But you don't throw Greek equations and all the stuff that I love to do, because that's not the way people will get the message. So I think, and especially in this space of immigration and crime, we have to get that message out to people. And in a way, not to necessarily change the mind, but to say, hey, here's what the science shows. Some closing thoughts. One of the major challenges that the US faces is how to reshape immigrant perceptions. Right now, the immigrant characterization in the United States is a certain type of immigrant perception in the United States. To fit the facts, this challenge only grows in importance because, as you all know, in the next 25 years, we're going to be a majority-minority country. That train's already gone, so that's going to happen, all right, for all the demographers in the room. This is the cover of the Atlantic. This was before there was no more room at the inn. That came out a couple weeks ago. This is the no vacancy sign. So how much immigration is too much immigration, right? We should not be naive that any of this stuff is going to affect policy. We've done as much as we can possibly humanly do in Washington right now. We're going to do another briefing in a couple months to continue to beat this drum as much as we can. But I think that the real national emergency right now is not the one on the southern border between Texas and Mexico, but I think it's the crisis that lies with individuals who turn a blind eye towards science. And in recognition of the name of this series, this lecture series, those are the minds that we need to liven up. Any questions? Do you have any? Remember now? This is a personal joke there. That's it. I'm happy to take questions. But Yoda stays. Yoda stays. I'm happy to take questions, or you get an extra 10 minutes of your day back. Either one. Sandy?
So have you spoken to any of the immigrants? You know, you're changing all of us, but sometimes I feel like they lose hope. And I just wonder if giving them a voice.
Yeah, so we've done that two different ways. We've done lectures, not lectures, but community events at different cities for immigrant populations. There are lots of immigrant community centers and the like. There's also a national organization on immigration reform that we've done some messaging with, and then they do the messaging down from them. So we've done some of that stuff. Most of our immigrant discussion has been focused on Hispanics because that's where the narrative is these days, and that's where our research is these days. But you can, the issue of immigration is interesting because the United States immigration issue is one kind, but if you go to Europe, it's not necessarily a racial immigration, it's a religious immigration issue or some other kind of issue. So at least culturally here, we've done some of that stuff. Margaret.
I was just wondering if you've had you've been on so many podiums, obviously, and you've been out there. How much have you done talk shows, Colin? Have you had that experience? You want to talk about?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the talk shows, the live ones are always very interesting because you don't know what's going to happen. So I've done NBC News, Latino, and NPR. Those are a little bit easier to navigate because the messaging is kind of somewhat controlled. I have I've not been approached by Fox News right now, but that's the audience. I mean, I would relish it in a way because that's the audience I need to get to, not to the audience who already agrees. So I've done some of them, and those are useful. When Molly Tibbetts was killed in Iowa, the young woman who ran, and the first suspect they had was an illegal immigrant, and then Trump immediately started saying what he said. I did stuff on Iowa Public Radio and the Des Moines Register to talk to people locally at that level. Oh, you don't know what you're talking about. The numbers lie. No, the numbers lie. And so at one point I got really.
My personal.
Yeah, oh yeah.
So how they.
Yeah, so I mean, you get everybody knows everything, but have nothing to back it up with, and that's as a scientist, that's the most frustrating part. Right? You're like just trying to. Okay, so if I'm wrong, then it should be easy for you to provide the data to show me that. But the problem in this area is this is what I believe, and this is what I believe. And there's no amount of penetrating that. And it's very frustrating. Yeah, a lot of it. Yeah?
Do you know of any studies that examine the relationship between people's attitudes about immigration and their proximity to immigrant population?
Yeah, so we just finished on that. So the space is, the answer is the closer they are to immigrants, the more supportive they will be of them. The farther they actually move away, not only in physical distance, the worse those perceptions, the more not supportive they are. Yeah. And it's a two-edged sword because immigrants tend to always locate themselves in one spot. And so you need to diversify that whole population. That's what you need to do. But yeah, the proximity matters a lot. Francesca?
Whether you've seen a change in attitudes towards immigration at all, and what that has correlated with besides political.
Yeah, so the only thing available is the Pew research. The thing with the Pew research, I mean, so you get ebbs and flows about, do you support immigration? Everybody supports immigration, just not the way immigration is done. So the issue is not one of immigration. The issue is perceptual, is how we're letting people in. Were we vetting people? Do we need to vet people? What kind of process do we create? What do we do with the dreamers? What do we do with these people? And all of that clouds the issue about immigration, which is, if you look at the origins of the United States, right? It's a country full of immigrants. So the problem with the Pew data is it doesn't track the same people over time. So I get a cross-section of 1,000 people, then another cross-section of another different 1,000 people. I don't know if those are the same 1,000 people. So for me, I'd want to track the same people's views over time. So I don't think we're there just yet. Yes, what's your name?
Nishani.
Nishani.
Thank you for this, for sharing this great information. I had a question about, in your pathways to resistance study, were you able to see any differences in gender among any of the race in crime and crime?
No, unfortunately, because we didn't have enough females in the data set. And let me tell you why. When we went to recruit in Philadelphia and Phoenix, we said, okay, we're going to take every serious violent offender, felonious juvenile offender that comes into the court system. So we sat there for 9 months. We literally had, well, not me, but an army of students sitting there for 9 months. The number of females who came into our study is about this big. Even though the perception was female offending is going through the roof, it's going through the roof, it's going through the roof. Well, they're not showing up in Philadelphia and Phoenix. So if it's going through the roof, it might be happening in Des Moines or Duluth, but not in those two cities. So we sat there and we weren't getting them in. So the problem in the pathway studies, we have 184 women. When you cross-tab that out with 82 first-generation immigrants, you have 8 people. So we just can't do what we want to do. And it wasn't for the sake of not trying to do it. We just don't know the answer. Joe.
Science question for you.
Yeah.
So it's, in some ways, the whole process of defining a conviction starts with an arrest.
Correct.
That's the front end, right? There's a series of steps that happen that involve, where branch points can occur. You have dismissal, you could have plea bargains or whatever. You might even have things that happen after conviction in terms of sponging records. I'm curious about data either from some of your studies or others that talk about differences among the first generation, second generation, and control.
I have no knowledge on that first generation, second generation, native borns comparison through the system at each of the decision points. What I do have is in the state of Texas, with another one of my former students, we have every single offender in the adult criminal justice system. We also know if they are illegal, legal, and then native born. So we look at the arrest process and follow them through to conviction to see if there are any differences across those, and there are not as they go along, which is really interesting. But we can't dissect it any better than that. The Texas data are great because they're publicly available, so anybody could do that. May and then Daniel. Go ahead.
I just wonder, have you looked at the geographical differences? And what I'm thinking is that, we know air transportation is safe. But if there is an airplane crash, everybody got really concerned. So if we have those criminal offenses clustered in certain locations, that may give the impression of the resident there that there is a lot going on than the LO area.
Always good to have a geographer expert in the room. We have not done that. But we could do that in the Florida data because we have all of that information at the Florida data. So yeah. Daniel.
I like what you said earlier about the differences between the first and second generation and that tension that they feel. And I think that kind of rich detail is what often convinces people. So the numbers are really important. I wonder if you see a role for case studies or vivid examples that demonstrate the point, because people often latch onto those again.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So in our pathway study, we had, I think we funded 12 to 20 doctoral students of some capacity. And we allowed them to scope out dissertation projects that they wanted at the outset. And we didn't say, here's the PIs, this is what we're going to do. You can have all these. We said, what would you like to do? So everybody was on a level playing field. And we had 3 students who are doing things like that. So one woman is doing a study of female offending and why they offend in a case study type of basis. And then another one's doing stuff with first generation and second generation comparisons, looking at Puerto Ricans and Mexicans to see how they navigate those 2 experiences. So those are in process. So we'll find out. Yeah, Chelsea.
Do you know if there's a difference in opinion about immigrants coming in from the north versus the south?
Well, the narrative right now is that we don't really care about the northern immigrants. Because the Canadians, She's Canadian, so. No, so that's when I said that the narrative now about immigration is a certain kind of immigration. So, when the whole, when the country exclusion lists came out 18 months ago, the president did say he would prefer to have some immigrants who had these characteristics from these countries. Those countries happen to be in the EU. His words. Yeah.
The millions of people in the criminal justice system, you think you have tons of data to work with. How come that's not the case?
So the fascinating question. So we don't have, in the United States, there's no one national way of collecting data. So you have 50 states, and then within those states, everybody does things differently. And most of the computer systems don't talk to one another. Here's the issue. Up until 2015, the FBI, who collates our uniform crime reports, never collected information on ethnicity. So up until 2015, if you were to ask me how many Hispanics in the United States have been arrested for robbery, The answer would be, I don't know, because we have not collected those data. So for about a 4-year period, I was a member of a National Academy of Science panel called Modernizing Crime Statistics, where we actually made recommendations to the FBI and to other agencies. These are the things you need to collect. Oh, by the way, see if you can get immigration status. The problem is getting that level of detail of data is very, very complicated, and the systems aren't there yet. Texas is one of the few states that actually does this. California does as well. So Texas and California are leading the charge of all states in terms of data collection mechanisms. But if you wanted to answer that question in Charlotte, North Carolina, you would have no idea. Both of those, and when police officers stop you on the street, they have typically a checklist, and most of those checklists were white, black, other for race. They never coded ethnicity. So they didn't want it. Literally, I sat next to a chief who said, do you know how long it'll take me to change the paperwork, to change the record management system, to do this? And I said, I don't care. This is what we need to do. It's like, find a way to do it, right? But that's the problem. Is that, and so all these agencies, Dallas is a perfect example of this. We're watching the legislative budget now go on about property tax, raises, funding officers, not officers, and then the chief needs to fund 500 more officers. Oh, and by the way, we need a whole another data management system. But we've been using this one for 40 years, and we all know how to use it. There's a lot of inertia against this. Yeah.
In your research, did you ever find results that please the Fox types? Or were you an equal opportunity offender to all?
The data. And here's why the data. We archive those data immediately after a 3-year period, because when the PIs sat together to do the project, we said we owe it to the taxpayers to have these data. So the data are publicly available. But this is why I stayed away from doing this kind of research for 20 years. Is because someone say, well, you're a Hispanic and you want the results. I'm not saying you're saying that, but I've heard that before. I've gotten emails from people in my inbox. Well, people.
They distrust the science because of that is what I was trying to say.
Yep.
It's excellent presentation.
Thank you.
But I was struck by one label that you've been getting repeatedly, second-generation immigrant. You say including yourself.
Yeah.
I wonder the origin of that label. Do you go on to tell people I'm an immigrant?
No.
Not, right? So why don't we call you and people like you second-generation American?
Yeah. No. So that's a great question, Mike. Here's the answer that is a great academic answer. We followed the work of Alejandro Cortez, who was the immigration assimilation scholar in the country. And that's what he did. I consider myself an American because I was born in America. So that's how I label myself. That would be a shot across the bow. He'd reject my paper.
Maybe time for one more?
Yeah.
As far as the first and second generation goes, which category do children fit into that under with their parents and
So here, I'll just use me. My mom and dad would be first, I'd be second, and my kid would be third. Then it would be fourth, fifth. If a kid is born, so if I was born in Mexico and I came to the United States, I would be a first generation kid. It's country of origin to new country.
All right, well, it is 3 o'clock. So
It is.
thank you all for coming. I think this has been a very
Thanks.
informative and exciting presentation.
Thank you.
Yoda.
Yoda. Thank you.